In the fifth installment of our How Art Got Ugly series, today on Radio Free History we are going to look at the first few years of the 20th century, up until World War I, from Fauvism to Cubism to Futurism to Dada. We will look at a number of avant-garde movements, some of which have very different ideas of taste and aesthetics. Our last episode, we were looking at Montmartre in Paris at the end of the century, at the end of the 19th century, and we left off right at the year 1900.
These are the miserable Paris bohemians.
Yes, they are.
The insufferable frickin' trust fund kid, little...
And the weebs like Vincent van Gogh, because he was a weeb. Listen to the last episode.
And like an attention cutter. Like he did the equivalent of like cutting himself and posting it on Facebook.
With the Japanese painting in the background.
Yeah.
So yeah, in the last episode we talked about all this weird avant-garde stuff in the late 1800s. We talked about Van Gogh, we talked about Cézanne, we talked about Toulouse-Lautrec, we talked about Gauguin.
I usually really like midgets. It's the saddest thing about Toulouse-Lautrec. You know, I have to once be like, you know what, no, I don't like this one.
I think I said last time, Toulouse-Lautrec, if Chris Farley had been a midget instead of a fat guy, he would have been Toulouse-Lautrec.
Debaucherous.
So we talked about this end of century avant-garde art, which maybe played fast and loose with the rules. You know, maybe the angles and the perspective were funny. Maybe the colors were a little more expressive, as they say. But it still looked kind of like something you see in the real world, admittedly with some distortion. And here's where we left off the last episode. We said that when we moved from the 1890s into the aughts, art starts to look like this. This
very hippie.
Well,
if this was in like some like commune in the 60s, I'd be like, yeah, that tracks.
Yeah. Well, this is called Fauvism, which we'll look at with all the weird colors. Now, this is by a guy named André Derain. This is called The Turning Road. One of the things we really talked about when we talked about the works of people like Cézanne is that they started ignoring the rules of perspective and the rules of depth, and they just used shading to get the same effect across. Again, go back and look at the last episode if you're not sure what I'm talking about.
They couldn't compete with camera for realism, so they said screw it and just did like non-realistic things.
Yeah, well, they were slightly more abstract, but they were still painting things that looked like the real world.
Well, perspectives you couldn't get with a camera.
Exactly, yeah. But when you're cheating a little bit by using color gradients, it works when you go from a shade of green to a slightly darker shade of green or a slightly lighter shade of green. It really doesn't work the same way when you go from a shade of orange to a shade of purple.
Yeah.
So this is where art really starts to get weird in the early 20th century, in the 1900s, when art really starts to break a lot of rules, and we have to start asking the question, is this even beautiful? Let alone, is it even art?
Like beautiful on like t-shirt, yes. Museum, though.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
This is like fine. If I had a t-shirt with this print on it, that would be a pretty nice t-shirt. But like, I wouldn't want to go see this in a museum. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So, we talked a lot last time about how the Paris art scene was a lot like New York in the late 20th century. In New York, you have the ballet, and you have the Rockettes, and you have the symphony. And in Brooklyn, across the East River, in places like Williamsburg, you have the hip-hop dancers who dance at the bar mitzvahs, and you have the hipsters playing their acoustic guitar. It's a very different ethos. You get status in high society if you dance with the ballet. You don't get any status in high society if you play your acoustic guitar in Brooklyn, as much as I might have appreciated that music. Mm-hmm. In Paris, you have very much the same thing. You have the salon art, the art that still looks like it's straight out of the Renaissance, and you have Montmartre, where you have people doing all sorts of weird avant-garde stuff. But it's not just a different style, it's the Montmartre artists. They all had to have a sense of hustle. Because it's not just you make your weird art and hope people buy it. It's you make your weird art and you have to find potential customers.
We're able to get their goods to market where they need to be, basically.
Yep. And just to review a little bit more, the idea of a middle class, it's something we take for granted in the year of our Lord 2025. In the year 1885, it's a new and novel concept. The idea of not being rich, but having still a little bit of money.
What do you mean? You're not a serf, but you're not a royal? What the fuck?
Yeah, that's...
What the hell's that?
So, art had moved from the courts of royals and nobles to these academic salons to now what are called the cenacles, the little communities of artists that love to sit around bitching about the bourgeoisie and then finding a bunch of self-loathing bourgeoisie to sell their stuff to.
Nothing changes.
No, that's... I was going to say just like now.
Yep.
If you're asking me when is this attitude finally going to start to change, my answer is when the middle class disappears, and it's disappearing.
Yeah, give it a few decades.
So, again, the salon system, it is starting to have its alternatives by the year 1900, but it's still serious. I mean, there's the academic artists, they have alternate salons that are not juried, where you don't have to be judged by people who say you didn't draw the guy's ankle properly, but it still is the serious way of doing things. And you have across town, you have this kind of stuff. And the difference between the 1890s and the 1900s is in the 1890s, all these people, Cézanne and Van Gogh and Gauguin, who you talk about in art history classes, none of them got famous in their own day. None of them got famous till decades after they were dead. In the 1900s, the art gets weirder, and you have a couple of people who actually start to see a bit of, I don't want to say fame in their own time. They get like Montmartre famous, or they get avant-garde famous. Okay. Weird people from all these cities across Europe know who Matisse is, and they know who Picasso is. Nobody really knew who Van Gogh was. But I also don't want to overplay that either. These are not, Quentin Tarantino, the hipster breaking all the rules who completely changed the landscape of things. These are still people who are only known within a very exclusive group. I talked about two men who get famous in their own time, Matisse and Picasso. And when I talk about Matisse, he's the first guy to get famous. I can't stress this enough. I am not saying the guy's not talented, but this is the age of the art merchant, and his talent is less relevant to the reason he gets famous than the fact that he's in the right place at the right time when it comes to getting connected with one of these art collectors or art merchants who determines who becomes important. Jeez. So, who is Matisse? He moves to Paris, he studies, he gets himself into the independent salon in 1899. Again, that's one of these serious salons, but it's not the big one. Again, it's like, I don't know, it's like the Rockettes, but it's not the New York Ballet. Okay. In 1903, I'm going to call it a pseudo-salon starts. It's called the Autumn Salon, but it's not a serious Paris salon. It's a Montmartre salon. It's where all of the small independent gallery owners go to showcase this new weird art that's coming out. We talked about Ambrose Villard last time. He was really the first guy to start seriously buying up this avant-garde art, largely because he ran a publishing company and he needed people to publish his books. Like I said, the Montmartre ethos is a lot more about hustle and entrepreneurship, but he was the first guy to start giving exhibits to people like Cézanne and Gauguin, and even after he's dead, he does an exhibit of Van Gogh's work. He's one of the people involved in this new art ecosystem, and the ecosystem creates the Autumn Salon in 1903, and Matisse, less successful with the high prestige art, but he gets well enough known in Montmartre that he starts getting into this new salon when it starts. In 1904, Matisse gets his own exhibit at Villard's Gallery. So again, every art history book or art history professor talks about this like it's important. Let's scale back our image of how important this is. There's a few artists and a few art collectors who care about this stuff in one neighborhood in Paris. That's it. But he's a working artist. He's able to sell enough stuff to pay the rent. And, you know, if you...
Darwinian.
Exactly. You know, he's not going to be the guy who shows off his art in one of these... He's not the people who's... You know, I'm just going to move on past that. So like he's a working artist, and as any YouTube musician can tell you, it's a lot easier to promote yourself if you're covering top 40 songs than if you're just trying to do your own weird stuff, especially if you're trying to promote yourself through Spotify. So, you know, you look at Matisse's paintings. It starts serious. He starts...
Dour.
Well, dour, but you know, if you're trying to prove you're a serious artist, you've got to give the people what they want. So he starts serious by painting these books, then he becomes impressionist. Then
T-shirt, nice.
Yeah, less realistic, but this is well after the Age of Impressionism. The Age of Impressionism is the 1870s, 1880s. This is into the 1900s. Then he starts using the colors of Vincent van Gogh.
Because they were all available now at the shop.
Yep, exactly. Like I said, all of these things that are called, that we now call avant-garde art, whenever some new upstart moves to Montmartre, it's a pattern you're going to see. They just start going through this whole pattern. They do an Impressionist painting, and then they do a Van Gogh-like painting, and then they do a Cézanne-like painting.
You think they're going to do this eventually with like shape posters?
Yeah, possibly.
Like there'll be some 100 years from now that we talking about some obscure fucking, you know, shit poster and like his unique memes that affected like it's kind of the same thing. Yeah. It's like they're representing something that's like famous on pole. That like has been like the general. Yeah, culture.
He's clearly influenced by T.J. Kirk here.
You can tell from the banana.
So in 1904, Matisse starts hanging out with Signac, who was a pointillist. Seurat, the guy who did A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, the Ferris Bueller painting, he had died at this point, so Signac was the surviving pointillist, and he hangs out with Matisse a little bit in 1904, and Matisse tries his hand at pointillist or divisionist painting, whatever you want to call this. It's supposed to be non-realistic with the different colored dots, but of course, if you look at some of those women on the beach, he makes sure to show their nipples.
Yeah, it's amazing what makes what's a priority for this guy.
Everything else is supposed to be abstract and not completely realistic, but he makes sure to get the boobs properly.
Man knows what sells.
Yeah, this painting is called Luxury, Calm, and Pleasure. Then in 1905, that's when he meets André Derain. He was the guy who did the first painting. Now, I don't know what kind of drugs they're doing together, but they come up with this idea to just say, fuck it, we're going to dick with the color palette completely.
I mean, absinthe for sure, probably cocaine.
Yeah, was cocaine invented back then?
Oh, yeah. Sigmund Freud thought that cocaine was the cure for depression, and he gave it to his mom.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up Freud. I mean, he's going to come up when we talk about the surrealists. But we talked last time about Klimt in Vienna because Vienna had its own avant-garde as well. There was apparently one cafe that he went to that was also frequented at the same time by Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, and Freud.
I would have loved to have seen all of them get into a fight or something. That would have been.
Oh, I want that to be a sitcom.
Yeah.
I know sitcoms are kind of a dead medium, but I want to see the wacky hijinks at this cafe.
They're real friends.
No, a couple of them were Jews.
Yeah,
I don't think they were the real friends.
It's important to notice as we watch this change in art that there's a very unsuccessful young Viennese street painter who couldn't get
And art school reject.
and art school reject, who is watching this change in art and he's not exactly liking what he's seeing. And he eventually will write a book about it and it'll be a little bit important. So,
His book about his struggle.
yep.
Yeah, it's just what we're talking about here. If you haven't gotten it, Hitler decides to declare a whole bunch of this art to be degenerate.
Yeah, he has a degenerate art exhibit at one point.
And this is what you're seeing in this episode is exactly what you would see if you had gone to the degenerate art exhibit.
As you were saying, you were telling me when you read Mein Kampf, you were expecting a lot of like international banker and like that kind of rhetoric, but it was like these people are ruining the arts.
Yeah, yeah. It's a book which nobody seems to have read. I decided to read it just to see what all the fuss was about, and yeah, he. If you want to know why, at least he said he had such a hate-on for these people. It's for the art you're about to see.
Yeah, Hitler was a shitty theater kid. That's lost a lot, but Hitler was a shitty theater kid. He's an evil nerd.
Matisse starts hanging out with Derain. They're doing all sorts of weird stuff like this.
Oh, it looks like a kid maybe did this.
Yeah. Well, this is what they decide. They decide to not just be Van Gogh making a few colors brighter or more expressive. They say, fuck it, we're going to go completely hog wild with all the new paints that are available. If you grew up in the 60s or 70s, this may remind you of an acid trip.
Yeah.
Remember Cezanne we talked about last time? He fucked with the perspectives, but was able to cover it up by having, a dark blue fading into a light blue or a light green fading into a dark green. He was using color gradients to hide the fact that his drawings weren't completely following the rules of perspective, but it kind of worked.
Yeah.
That just doesn't work when you have like orange and sickly green. You can't have one fade into the other.
No, it was a clear demarcation.
Yeah. So
it's like the Koreas.
Yeah. So if you're doing this kind of weird stuff, fine, knock yourself out, but you're going to have to come up with a whole bunch of new techniques to make it work. And at least when these paintings were made, these were the early paintings. We'll say that's a work in progress. Yeah. We'll say this technique is being developed.
The one on the right is deeply upsetting.
I think they're all kind of upsetting.
Like at least on the left, it looks like organized a little bit. The right just looks just a mess.
It's supposed to be, I think, a path going out to the ocean, but I don't know.
Trees. My mind is like, no, I'm not putting this together. I'm not going to make this any better. We're just going to.
But remember I said that Matisse is in the right place at the right time? Well, 1905 is exactly the right time to make this kind of weird drug trip art, because art is like anything else. First, something starts out as being exclusive, then technology opens it up to the masses and almost democratizes it. Then you get an ecosystem of merchants buying and selling it. And then, especially when it comes to creative endeavors, you get a distribution network, and the ethnic makeup of some of these distribution networks tends to be quite constant.
And unsurprising.
Matisse is not a member of the tribe, but he's about to get in on the ground floor of one of the world's great nascent Jewish distribution networks.
If any of you have read Thomas Sowell, this is a classic middleman minority group.
Mm-hmm. Well, just as when we talked about the Impressionists, we talked about Paul Durand-Ruel probably being the most important person there. He wasn't an artist. He was the guy who had enough hustle to sell the Impressionist stuff in America. You know, without him, there's no real Impressionist movement. It's going to be the same thing here. It's not the artists, it's the people who make up the rest of the ecosystem.
Like how it's not Jesus, it's Solitas.
Well, yeah.
The guy who went out and sold it.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's like, you know, you go to Hollywood, a small percentage of people are the actors, and then there's 95% of Hollywood that's just there to stroke the actors' egos. Every failed actor who moves out to Hollywood who can't make it becomes like Tom Cruise's personal trainer or something, or at least trained Tom Cruise once at one personal training session in 1997.
It's like power in that world isn't what you can do, it's who you know.
Yeah.
So it
same
all
thing
becomes
here.
about name dropping.
Yep, same thing here.
Jesus.
So in 1905, he exhibits this. He exhibits this work at the Autumn Salon. It's called The Woman with a Hat, and it causes a bit of a scandal.
It delivers what it says, but also is that her boob?
Is that her boob? Is she about to vomit?
A sword? She's sitting in a chair? There's a lot of ambiguity here.
So, one guy calls it the ugliest daubings of paint he's ever seen.
I like that guy.
Well, the thing is, at the end of it, he decides to buy it.
Jesus Christ. This is like a so bad it's good situation.
Well,
like it's like a Troll 2.
That man, his name is Leo Stein, and we'll talk about him in a second. But yes, Leo Stein is of the ethnicity you think he is. Now, at these, I think his ancestors come from Germany, but at these salons, these exhibits, you are supposed to put your asking price on all of these paintings. And in just truly expected fashion, when the 3-week salon is over, everybody has said everything they can about this painting that you see on the screen. This guy decides to buy it, but then he decides to lowball Matisse on the price.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, it's...
Yeah, the one critic says there was a... One critic said that there was a sculpture in front of this painting, and he said it was like Donatello among the wild beasts. Yeah, go back to the first episode. Donatello was a sculptor. The French word for wild beast is les fauves, so they call this fauvism. Okay. I mean, if somebody says you're like wild beasts, that sounds kind of badass.
Yeah.
Yeah, fauvism is this idea of just getting really weird with the color, but it's not something they made up themselves. It's they just decided to run with some critic trying to call them idiots.
Oh, okay. Like the Quakers or something.
So, who is the buyer? Who is this Leo Stein guy? His father was a Jewish immigrant to Pennsylvania. He made the family fortune by selling supplies to railroads during the steel boom. Because again, no stereotypes broken here. And 3 of this guy's shit-eating kids end up in Paris in the 1900s. First, Leo moves. He's just your typical rich kid who wants to have the cultural immersion experience. We all know that type, right? Yeah, Leo, he moves to Paris in 1903. And just a word here, modern art historians are full of shit. Every single book about this guy has slightly different details, but like this guy isn't some guy who owns an art gallery or something. He's not somebody who has a record of every painting he buys and sells. He's just a rich kid who decides to hang out with creatives, and he has the money to buy some of their stuff. So just what am I saying here? If you read books about Leo Stein, you might have 1 or 2 of the details different than what I'm about to say here. I don't care. The whole story, the general story is accurate, but every source I read about him just seems to have a couple details different. The kid shows up in Paris, and he decides to start building up an art collection. And again, we're trying to build up the story of a rich kid slumming it. We're sure he owns some of these pieces, some of them we're not so sure about.
Okay.
Like
Some accretion.
Well, he doesn't have a manifest. He's if you were a rich kid and you moved to Brooklyn and you wanted to buy your shitty friend's art, would you have a manifest for everything you bought? I'm not autistic enough for that, and I'm pretty fucking autistic.
I hate paperwork.
Oh, that's ADD.
Oh, there we
Or
go.
ADHD, I should say.
There we go.
Leo Stein, he moves to Paris in 1903. He starts acquiring a bunch of these paintings. Again, none of the academic painting, though he does buy a couple of like Delacroix and Monets. And we said a couple of episodes ago that Monet was never that important in his own day, but he starts becoming important after the fact. One of the reasons is that Leo Stein gets a bunch of Monets in his collection. And Monet's long since dead at this point. Just to show you how arbitrary some of this stuff is.
What a weird bottleneck.
Yeah. So Stein, he decides to buy this painting by Cezanne.
Okay, not the worst one.
No, but I mean, again, we talked about Cezanne last time. He doesn't really have a lot of perspective. It's kind of flat.
Yeah.
His buildings look like children's building blocks.
Yeah.
All that stuff is here. It's not the best Cezanne painting out there. But Stein, when he moves to Paris, he goes to the Vallard Gallery. Because again, the Vallard Gallery is where you have your Van Goghs and everything. He buys this painting here, starts building up a bit of a collection, and then he brings his batshit crazy Jewish American sister over to Paris to live with him.
These are always interesting families. This guy's from New York.
Yeah,
There you go.
well, it's from Philadelphia, but it's the same shit. Pittsburgh, I think. It's still it's going to be an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Yeah.
So you know how Gavin McInnes, he would talk about moving to New York and talk about all these artsy Jewish women who are all melodramatic and neurotic and BPD. They give you this long moralizing soliloquy about their sexual mores, and then they all want to take it up the ass.
It's a trope.
Yeah.
It's a type, definitely.
Yeah. So that's Gertrude Stein.
Oh, okay.
Frank Zappa got in trouble in 1979 for writing a song called Jewish Princess. Now, the Anti-Defamation League got on Zappa's case, and Zappa said, unlike the unicorn, this creature actually does exist. He also said, as if to say there's no such thing as a Jewish princess, like I invented this.
Yeah, that's...
So, yeah, I'm very clear. I am not saying this is all Jewish women. I'm not even saying this is most Jewish women. I'm just saying that when you read these lyrics by Frank Zappa, he is describing a certain type, and he's describing them accurately. And this certain type tends to be a hanger-on at the fringes of every big city and university town with an artistic community. And it applies to Gertrude Stein. Okay. These lyrics apply to Gertrude Stein, like him or not. The ADL actually did ask the FCC to ban this song, but nobody was playing it because the lyrics were a little too explicit. But you draw your own conclusions over that one. It was without further ado. I'm just going to read a couple of lyrics from this song. She don't know shit about cooking and she's arrogant looking. She has Titanic tits and sandblasted zits. She has a couple of sisters who could raise a few blisters.
Yes, yeah, that's typically a very interesting family attached to a character like this.
She has a brand new nose and she knows where it goes. Anyways, I think you get the point here.
There's definitely some tropes.
Yeah, Gertrude Stein is one of these creatures. And modern day academics love Gertrude Stein because she gets into a lesbian relationship with her housekeeper. Now, her housekeeper, her name was Alice Toklas. She was from San Francisco. She lost everything in the big San Francisco earthquake. And she, being a Jewish woman herself, these people know how to move to a different city and get in with the network. She ends up in Paris. She intends to stay there for a couple of months or maybe longer. And Gertrude hires her as the housekeeper and then promptly gets into a lesbian relationship with her.
Everything old is new again. This is like something like a polycule from frickin' Portland.
Totally. Yeah, it's absolutely what. If Gertrude Stein were alive, she would be the ugly girl in the polycule.
Okay.
Leo and Gertrude, they have a bit of a falling out in 1913. Now, again, every art history book says, oh, they disagreed over what kind of art to collect. Bullshit. I've watched Curb Your Enthusiasm. I just know these are two neurotic Jews who...
There's going to be conflict.
Yeah.
These are a conflict-prone, dramatic group of people.
So when Leo decides to fuck off in 1913, he leaves Gertrude and the housekeeper, who she's in a questionably ethical lesbian relationship with.
Yeah, it's not so ethically non-monogamous.
But remember, I said there were 3 siblings who came over because there was a third brother who was managing the family finances. Because Gertrude, she wanted to be the center of culture in Paris. I should also say that, you know, all of this avant-garde stuff took place in Montmartre. The Stein family, they were too rich. They didn't want to live in Montmartre. So, yeah, it's the third brother who's taking care of the family finances. And when Gertrude dies, the lesbian lover is left penniless because the third brother's saying, no, you're not getting all of this valuable art whose value we've been artificially inflating by manipulating the market.
We never set out to say that it's the chosen people manipulating a market, but sometimes
that's the thing about history is I don't make up these stories, I discover these stories.
Yeah.
I'm just saying this lesbian relationship that academics all love, it's just another Jewish woman saying fuck you, Dad.
It reminds me of Big Mouth.
Yeah.
Like the girl's mom runs off with the cantor.
So, to put a button on the story about her lesbian lover, first of all, James Merrill, who was an American writer, he met the lesbian lover, Toklas. He said she had tiny stature, sandals, and a mustache.
So, like, Latidra chick.
Yeah. So,
this is a trope.
So, after Gertrude dies and Alice Toklas is left, penniless, she tries to survive by publishing a cookbook in 1954, and this cookbook contains a recipe for fudge containing spices, nuts, fruit, and marijuana. I've been going over this for 2 episodes now. Everything that we now think is edgy, it hasn't just been done since the 60s, it's been done since like the late 1800s.
Yeah, this is...
like
counterculture that's not,
we are stuck in a cycle. We are stuck in a cycle here. We grew up in the 90s, maybe the early 2000s, when a lesbian relationship and pot brownies were seen as edgy.
Yeah. It was just, it's a trope.
By the 50s, an old woman desperate to pay the bills was selling pot brownie recipes.
When the jazz age was the 20s and 30s?
Yeah.
So it's already passé.
It's the same bohemian LARP since the 1880s. Just if I can get any point across. Back to Leo Stein, though. I mean, he's important in giving people like Matisse and Picasso enough work to not starve. But the art collection that he builds up is the one that is going to end up in all the American modern art museums after the family dies and this art gets scattered to the wind. But the American modern art industry is a subject for next time. But the Steins, before Gertrude pisses off Leo and they never speak again, because of course they never speak again. Total Curb Your Enthusiasm stuff. The two of them, they host a party every week. They call it a salon. Again, the salons were originally where the church and the state, discovered the new coming talent to paint the big, culturally important paintings. It may have been a little bit presumptuous for these people to call their little pretentious parties a salon, but so be it.
Like Patriot University.
Yeah. But yeah, every hipster in Paris is going to their place. Matisse becomes their friend after Leo buys his weirdly colored woman with a hat painting, and a couple years later Picasso does as well. And these two are later recognized as the two of the most famous artists of the 20th century. But if you read Tom Wolfe's book, The Painted Word, about the art world, and then he wrote this in the 70s, He put it perfectly. He said the public isn't invited and they never were. This is not like the movies or literature where you can sell millions of paperbacks or get millions of asses in seats. The public still has the veto power. If the critics hate something, the public can still make a work of art successful. That's just not what happens in the visual art world. A small group of people, they buy and sell art from a small group of artists. They talk about it with their friends. Some dilettante writes an article about it, and by the time it's important enough for John Q. Public to know about it, everybody has long since moved on. We still have a ways to go, but that's just how Matisse gets his work into a art collection that becomes important 20 years later. But as far as Matisse is concerned, he's just trying to sell this weirdly colored art to pay the rent. Again, you can gatekeep cinema all you want, but when Mel Gibson says, I'm going to do my movie about the crucifixion and portray the Jews in a biblically accurate way, and I'll finance it out of pocket if I need to, when that movie becomes successful, it's part of the movie world. You don't get that in the art world. There's no Mel Gibson of the art world.
No democracy, just small group of people. Jesus, I was listening to the Mel Gibson tape. Every now and again I go back and listen, just hear a guy just completely freak out. And this is the guy who beat the game in Hollywood.
Yup.
He's a billionaire because he remade the freaking Stations of the Cross.
But did it in a way that just wasn't kosher.
With lots of blood. Mm-hmm. Blood's not kosher.
Music is the same. Obviously, the symphony still has a bit of institutional gatekeeping, but it still has to pass the test of public exposure with high society.
Still has to do fucking, Disney covers.
Yeah.
Whatever else.
But I'm just saying, art, there's a small number of collectors, maybe 10,000 if you're counting, extra aggressively. And they live in London, New York, Berlin, Paris, Milan, maybe a small handful of other cities. You have other places where, like Copenhagen, Barcelona, Chicago, Los Angeles, where maybe a couple of rich people can move the needle. But even then, they fly to London for the art auction. They don't have the art auction there themselves.
Yeah, what I learned about like the Toronto money is they're forever running to Europe and New York.
Yep.
And Montreal.
These days, you have Christie's and Sotheby's. They have it locked down. I'm sure you can get involved through the internet in one of these art auctions, but it's still a very closed system. So, some housewife with her MRS degree in Billings, Montana, if she wants to spend $5 million of her husband's money on some Banksy painting, fine. But that still doesn't make Billings, Montana an important part of the art world. It doesn't make it an important node in the network.
Yeah, it's these weird little social circles centered around these urban hubs.
Yep. And, like...
These people are weird, folks. I work some of these parties. These people are unusual.
Yeah, we talked about Gustave Courbet in the last episode and also in the episode before that. He was the first guy to really self-promote in the 1840s. He was not the guy selling the caricatures on the waterfront. He was not appealing to the public at all. He was finding nouveau riche people in Paris who wanted to prove they weren't Eurotrash. He would sell to some local merchant, and after a few years, there might be a newspaper article written about how this Courbet guy managed to short-circuit the salon system. And if social climbers wanted to maintain their image, they at least needed to be aware of this guy. But the whole quote-unquote art world has been like this since the 1840s. Think about 20th century art. Did your parents like Jackson Pollock or Andy Warhol, or did they collect Warhol paintings the way they collected Pink Floyd albums? No. They read articles in Time magazine about this weird guy in New York who was supposedly the next big thing, and then they started name-dropping Andy Warhol because he wanted to sound important. That's just how the art world works. And that's how the Stein family is going to work as well. Because, again, they were just one of these self-hating nouveau riche families who wanted to prove they weren't bourgeois, even though the family fortune came from selling railroad supplies.
It's a great deal.
Well, yeah, they were self-hating middle-class people, and they needed a bunch of artists to give them validation. So yeah, Leo Stein, he moves to Paris. He decides he wants to be the bourgeois bohemian, the American in Paris, the hipster who works a 9-to-5 job. But he still has daddy's money, and he's buying up all the art from Paul Durand-Ruel and Ambrose Villard and the other modern art dealers. Gertrude comes over. Their apartment becomes the place to be for every hipster in Paris. They're not just going to be patrons of the arts. They're kind of trying to buy friends.
Yeah, buying your way into this social circle.
Like Shakespeare has a lesser-known play called Timon of Athens, and his whole tragic flaw is that he starts as a noble with all sorts of money, and he has no friends, so he keeps, giving away all these lavish gifts to people to hang out with him. And the play ends with him poor and living alone in a cave.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Stein is the guy who's he becomes friends with Matisse and Picasso and all these other artists, but he's just buying their favor.
Mm.
And like I said, in 1905, that's when he goes to the Autumn Salon. He buys Woman with a Hat. He lowballs Matisse because God forbid he miss one Jewish stereotype.
So he's like, if these people were streamers, he'd be a pay pig, basically?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, all right. Just to, I don't want to put it in context.
Yep. Oh, again, every professor wearing a tweed jacket talks about these people like they're visionary artists. No. If there's one thing I'm trying to do with this series, it's, put these people in the proper context of modern creative types. And yeah, the pay pig is a very good way to put it. And Matisse becomes friends with the Stein family, and at this point, that's enough to get you Paris famous, or at least Paris hipster famous, but there's still only like 12 people who give a shit about his work. But magazines do start talking about him here and there, because again, the guy with the money is not just buying artist friends, he's buying journalist friends as well.
Yeah, there we go, there's the other shoe dropping.
And the Steins parties, they become Paris important for about a decade. But if you've ever known a group of hipsters who throw parties, after about a decade, those parties just become really sad. And the group gets smaller because creatives love to backstab each other. Yeah, again, eventually Leo gets in this fight with his sister, says, wait a second, I'm not a loser, and goes back to New York City and starts writing for the New Republic. But in that time, he's bought up all this art, and he makes friends with all of these avant-garde artists. And but in particular, one young artist starts going to these salons at the Stein apartment, and he sells a lot of works to them, and that's talking about Picasso. Mm-hmm. And just to be very clear here, Picasso was making all of his famous art at this point, but this is like the mid-1900s. This is like 1907. He's just some fuck-up art school kid in Montmartre at this point. He doesn't become famous until the 1920s, and he doesn't become world famous until decades after that. When Picasso becomes famous, this art collection is going to become very important, and when that happens, the Steins are going to get very rich, and Matisse is going to become famous as well. Just to recap the timeline here, the current art establishment says that Matisse and Picasso are the most famous artists of the first half of the 20th century, maybe even the whole 20th century. That probably speaks more of the downfall of art than anything else, but they're selling all of their shit between 1905 and 1911.
It's a small window.
Yep. And then they become famous in the 20s and the 30s. So this is what I'm saying, the public is not invited when this art gets sold. It gets sold in 1905, 1906, and by the time the public is even aware of it, like, everybody's moved on to something else. The public does not have any say in what art becomes the important art.
They're just following along, well in the rear.
Yeah, they're not even following along. It's like they're not even part of the equation. But like I said, it's already artificial to talk about these guys having an impact on things because so much of their fame is retroactive. But Paris is still the New York of the day, and there are still avant-garde movements in other cities, and they're at least aware of Matisse and Picasso. When we start looking at the avant-garde movements in the other cities, you'll see some of them doing Fauvist paintings and Cubist paintings and stuff. Matisse and Picasso, they're not nobodies, but they're like the Shins or the Decembrists or some of these people. They're the acoustic guitar playing bands at Lee's Palace.
Yeah, they're not the freaking Taylor Swift or whatever.
Yep, so for the rest of this episode, we're going to take a look at Matisse and Picasso and all the other avant-garde scenes around Europe. And again, there just aren't that many of them. But we're going to take a look at what goes on from the time the Steins show up in Paris until World War I, which is just about a decade, a little more than a decade. All the stuff we're going to look at today, all this stuff is bought for a couple of years after World War I, during the so-called modern era, and that's it. So even though it's all retroactively important, even though the equivalent of Time magazine might do the occasional write-up of Pablo Picasso, even the works of people like Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, none of the stuff we're talking about sells until the 1920s. So the whole narrative from the Impressionists up to the 20s, it's in some sense it's artificial, or at least it's survivorship bias. In the next episode, we'll look at what happens in the 20s, but in the meantime, we're just going to look at what happens up until World War I. The big winners in this period are the collectors who happen to be hoarding all the right paintings and sculptures, and nobody wins that game more than the Stein family does. To be clear, though, absolutely nothing I've said up to this point or from this point forward is any comment on the aesthetic quality of things here. In fact, I think some of this art looks like shit, if you want me to be completely honest. The academic art is still getting sold, and it still will up until World War I. But, as I said, when the guy with the funny mustache becomes Führer, he's going to declare all the art we're looking at to be degenerate.
He's got some ideas about painting and culture.
We'll leave it to you guys to decide whether or not Hitler has a point. That's the point I'm trying to make here.
About art, not about anything else.
So let's talk about the various art movements. When I say art movement, these are all like 6 people who decide to do the same weird kind of art in one of these little avant-garde scenes, and they call it a movement. But the first one of these movements that we talked about was Fauvism. Matisse and Derain, they decided in 1905 to unhinge themselves from natural color. Van Gogh would use the expressive color palette that wasn't always realistic. Gauguin, he broke apart form and color, and Cézanne, he removed the realism from shapes and by using shading instead of perspective. The Fauvists are going to get very wild with the colors, and you can't do that anymore, like something like this. Mm-hmm. When Matisse wrote about this painting, he specifically said that he was not trying to replicate anything in nature. This is called nude in a wood because it's a nude in a wood. He makes even sure to draw her ass crack in there.
Yeah, or his.
Yeah. He's a French guy drawing nudes.
Yeah. Short hair. This might be what is it, Yao? Whatever the hell they call it. Whatever. Not that up on this stuff. I don't know.
No, I know what you're talking about. Unfortunately, look it up if you're not.
Don't look it up.
No, don't.
You're gonna get some weird targeted ads.
Especially don't look it up if you're on a work computer. Your boss might appreciate you listening to an art history podcast. He won't appreciate you looking up Yahoo.
No. Oh God.
After 1905, which is when he sold the woman with a hat painting, here's some of the stuff he sells afterwards. This is called Le Bonheur de Vivre, or the Joy of Life. I'd say it almost looks like Hieronymus Bosch or something, like the little symbolist paintings you saw in the Renaissance age. When he revealed this painting, Signac said, "Oh, this guy's losing it." I actually think this painting is slightly more interesting than the stuff he was doing before, but
at least this got my attention.
Yeah. Then there's this one. Some people call this the most famous ugly painting ever done.
Yeah, this looks like something out of Rotten.com. This looks like a dead prostitute.
Well, yeah, it's called the Blue Nude. This is actually the last one of his paintings bought by the Stein family. It's sometimes called primitivism, like instead of making stuff realistic, it's maybe not that abstract, but it's really broken down into its elements.
How did he know about really bad boob jobs?
I don't know.
That's what do you call it? Clairvoyance here. That's interesting. This looks like kind of an attempt at a female, if you understand my. Not a kind of bad ersatz attempt.
Yeah, well, I mean the current bad ersatz attempts, a lot of them have that haircut.
The mullet came back.
Oh, really?
I did not have the mullet coming back. Well, that's what these, the hipsters are now sporting mullets and things. So, anyway.
You know you're getting old when the shit from your childhood is becoming the nostalgia joke. Like I said, this painting, the Blue Nude, it's a famous painting because it ends up at the Armory show, but you draw your own opinions about it. He wasn't the only person who was involved in Fauvism. Every one of these movements is like 4 people. This guy, his name is Maurice de Vlaminck. He's a Flemish painter. This is called the River Seine at Chateau. Again, it's supposed to be a seascape on the river. The colors are a bit weird and fucked up. You also see Seurat's pointillism here. It looks like something that has weird colors, so alright.
Yeah, you can tell it's a boat. 6 out of 10.
And then there was this one that I showed earlier. This is The Turning Road by Derain. Some people say this is the best Fauvist painting, because I mean, Fauvist was only for a couple of years. I'll say, at least I can see the structure here.
Yeah, maybe a sunset. It's interesting.
Yeah. Like you said, it might look good on a t-shirt now.
Yeah. I'm going to put this on a t-shirt. This is public domain, right?
The guy's long since dead. He's
okay. I'm going to put this on a t-shirt.
Then, after 1908, he starts moving away from Fauvism, but he still keeps the weird colors. I'm talking about Matisse here. This is called The Dance. So, the interesting thing about this, there's a guy named Sergei Shukin. Remember I said there's just a very small number of these collectors? This guy is this really eccentric Russian merchant. He's one of these people who, like the Steins and like Vallard, is buying up all the Van Gogh and the Gauguins and the Cézannes. He commissions Matisse to make this. Matisse actually goes to Moscow to do it. It's called The Dance. And it's only 3 colors in the entire painting, but it's interesting, the use of color and everything, the use of very minimalistic shapes.
I wouldn't want to be exhibiting this in Moscow, but...
Well, this is the thing. When they have a change of management halfway through World War I, this art ends up confiscated because anything that's supposed to be avant-garde is not meant for the common man, so it's not revolutionary.
Yep.
So just, of course, these people who try to do this weird stuff to be part of the revolution looking forward when the communists come in, no, yet.
Yeah, spoilers. To would-be revolutionaries today.
Here's a couple of more paintings. This, I don't know if this necessarily counts as Fauvism because you don't have the weird wild color palette that seems to use all sorts of different colors, but he's clearly not doing things to be realistic anymore. He's still using color to make a point. It's a lot more abstract. Again, there's no perspective here in the way that Cézanne didn't have perspective. This is the stuff he's known for. He's known for the rest of his life as being the guy who's willing to use a weird, crazy color palette.
Okay.
So the next important art movement, we've all heard of it, Cubism.
Oh, okay. Even I heard of this one.
Yeah. Now, again, just as 1905 is the year of Fauvism at the Autumn Salon, where the woman in the hat was bought, 1910 is the year of Cubism. Obviously, the most famous name associated with Cubism is Picasso. Now, Picasso had the chops. He did this as a teenager.
That's nice. Talented kid.
Some of these other artists, I am not convinced they were any good.
Yeah.
But Picasso did this when he was like 16 years old, called the First Communion. So he's a prodigy. He moves to Paris. He could get involved in the serious salon art, but he says, I don't want to do that. I want to do the avant-garde stuff.
So like a Banksy.
Yeah, kind of,
Oh.
yeah.
But not shit.
Yeah. He's talented. He does produce paintings. He produces enough paintings to be a working artist. But to be clear, he is not the Picasso, the celebrity yet. He's just a dirty guy in Paris.
Jenny from the block.
He's Jenny from the block, yes. Every art history book talks about his blue period and his rose period, but this is all kind of retroactively said about him. And nobody would give a shit about him until at least a decade after this, probably a decade and a half. Guys, he's just another painter grinding it out. But, this is his blue period. He does this self-portrait.
Igor.
Yeah, and the famous painting, The Man with the Guitar.
Yeah, I like this one.
Yeah. He hasn't really started dabbling in the weird stuff. People say this is him being cubist. This is not him being cubist. This is just him being a bit stylized. Then 1904 to 1906 is his rose period. He has a lot of stuff with like circus performers and acrobats and harlequins. Now, funny thing about traveling circus performers, the local prostitutes were able to go do confession at the church because the priest at least knew who they were. The traveling harlequins, no priests would do confession with them because they didn't know if they were going to be gone the next day, if they didn't know if they were going to be taking penance seriously. So, yeah, the traveling performers were viewed as lower than prostitutes.
Yeah, they wouldn't even bury them in some parts of England.
Picasso, he sees himself as one of these harlequins. You might say nowadays he sees himself as a gypsy. I don't think he would have appreciated that back then.
Oh, certainly not a few decades hence.
He meets up with the Stein family, and one of the things he does after his rose period is he gets a collection of masks. There's actually one collection of masks he's given, and it turns out they were stolen from the Louvre.
Oh,
but
it's unfortunate.
But he gets some Iberian heads, he gets some African masks, and he starts doing paintings like this, where he's doing a portrait, but the face is almost done like a mask. Then he paints Gertrude Stein.
Wow. Yeah, we're not breaking any stereotypes.
No, she don't know shit about cooking, and she's arrogant looking, as Frank Zappa said.
Holy shit.
She's the butch in that relationship.
I've worked this woman's bar mitzvah. This is something's happened. This is a trope.
Yeah.
This woman, I've seen this woman. This is a type.
But the thing is, he does make her face look a little more mask-like, because that's what he's doing at this point in his career. Apparently, it took like 80 sessions of him getting her to sit for the portrait. And afterwards he says, fuck it, I'm just going to do the face like a mask.
Wow.
But, this painting becomes a famous painting. Like, any book you read about Gertrude Stein has this painting in it.
Yeah.
So, there you go.
I'm reminded of like Gollum's wife.
Yeah.
That's what just the energy that comes off this picture. This woman is going to want to talk to the manager.
Now, you're talking about weird energy coming off a picture.
Yeah,
This is sometimes called the first Cubist painting. This is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. If you talk to any modern art historian, they'll say that this is probably one of the three most important paintings of the 20th century. So, what is this? In 1906, Cézanne had died. I think he died in 1903 or 1904. Cézanne had died, but at Ambrose Villard's gallery, again, there's a whole ecosystem of these people. We keep bringing up the same dealers and galleries.
and certain cultural choke points.
Yeah. The Villard Gallery is the center of Montmartre's weird avant-garde scene. And Villard has a Cézanne retrospective where Picasso goes and he sees all of Cézanne's paintings that just don't have any depth to them and break everything into the weird geometric shapes. Also at Trocadero Palace, which had been built for the World's Fair a few years earlier, they had an exhibit of masks from around the world. And Picasso decides to just do this experimental painting just in his studio, where he's trying to do stuff like Cézanne, where you break things into geometric shapes, and every piece of this has a different perspective.
Okay.
Like, they're not we looked at the Renaissance perspective tricks where the lines all go to the same point. It's almost like you've broken everything into a bunch of pieces and then glued the pieces on a flat sheet.
Okay.
So this is what eventually becomes known as Cubism, but this is just something weird he does for himself. He just hangs this on the wall in his own studio, and every other weird avant-garde artist in Paris says, hey, you gotta go to this Picasso guy's studio and see this weird, trippy thing that he's got.
So it's like this unreleased album.
Yeah, well, for a little while, yeah. It eventually gets released, but yes. It's like Chinese democracy.
Oh, okay.
I'd say nobody under the age of 30 is going to get that. Very few people under the age of about 43 are going to get that.
Yeah. Shout out to our older listeners. Our more venerable listeners.
Yeah. You talk about women hitting the wall. Nobody hit the wall worse than Axl Rose did.
I don't know. Whatever's keeping that man alive. This needs to be studied.
In 1907, he does Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And like everybody in Paris wants to go at least visit his studio so they can take a look at this. Even Degas, who was one of the Impressionists, who was like I think in his 70s or 80s at this point. He was the guy who did all the ballet dancers in the studio. Even he comes out of retirement just because he wants to see this thing that everybody's talking about. But it just hangs in his studio for 10 years. He doesn't think anybody's going to want to buy this. He probably was right on that assessment. But again, you see the masks. You see the African masks here. You see Cézanne. You see the perspective lines fucked up. You can say a lot of things. You can say it looks like broken glass. You can say it's disjointed anatomy. You can say it's broken down and built up. Books say a lot of things about this painting. But the important thing is that the subject matter of painting prostitutes is nothing new.
No, they love doing it. They all do it.
Now, even though this is sometimes called the first Cubist painting, I think the credit for Cubism really goes to his partner, Georges Braque. Because he's the guy who really consciously starts painting like Cézanne, but wants to take it a step farther. This is why it's called Cubism, because this kind of looks like there's a lot of cubes in this painting.
Yeah, okay.
A critic says, what are these Cubist forms? And he just runs with the name, just like the Fauvists run with the name as well.
Okay.
So what inspires him to do these weird paintings full of these weird blocks? Well, we're going to have to go back to the previous episode when we were talking about Cézanne. These paintings are called The Houses at L'Estaque and The Viaduct at L'Estaque. That is an homage to the painting on the right here, which we looked at. This is the Bay of Marseille viewed from L'Estaque. Remember we talked about how he said it looked like a playing card.
Yeah.
And the sky and the mountains and the buildings and the land, they're all kind of on their own separate rules. Yeah. We talked about this last time. But more importantly, the houses at the bottom are very minimalistic, but they kind of give the image a grid. Well, Braque, if you look at the painting on the left, he just basically makes an entire painting out of those houses. And yeah, I guess they're technically supposed to be houses, but really the whole point of the painting is these geometric shapes.
Okay.
And after a couple of years, Picasso starts doing stuff like this. It's called The Girl with the Mandolin.
Another badass album cover.
Oh yeah. Well, this is called analytic cubism, but it's like taking those houses from the previous picture and now just turning everything into those blocks.
Okay. Tetrisy.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. And that's, if you want to know what really puts Picasso's name on the map, it's this very, very short period in his life.
Okay.
Well, okay, when I say it puts him on the map, it at least makes him avant-garde famous. It doesn't make him society-wide celebrity, but in 1910, 1911, him and Brock come up with paintings like this where they just don't just make houses that look like blocks, they make entire paintings that look like they're made out of these blocks. The one on the left is done by Brock, and the one on the right is done by Picasso. You know, the one on the left is Man with a Guitar. The one on the right is Majoli. I don't know if the one on the left necessarily looks like a guitar. I don't know if the one on the right looks like, you know, a woman who I would assume Majoli is about. But this is what Cubism becomes. It technically is supposed to be a picture of something, but they've broken everything down into these weird blocks, just like those houses were.
Okay.
They render everything as these faceted forms. Another guy who's maybe not as famous as them is Metzinger. And again, just like all of these artists, they have a realistic looking painting, then they do an impressionist painting, then they do a Van Gogh-like painting. At this point now, every painter who's trying to make a name for himself is going to do one Fauvis painting and one Cubist painting. And this is what he does. He does one Fauvis painting. It's also called The Woman with a Hat. It doesn't even make up a new subject matter. And the one on the left is called Tea Time. So this is Cubism's just for a couple of years, between about 1910 and 1912, just all the rage in the Paris avant-garde scene, and everybody's gonna try their hand at doing one Cubist painting. But yeah, this is still avant-garde shit. This is not famous stuff. This is still just Brooklyn famous stuff. They sell their stuff to the Steins and these other small collectors, but I can't stress it enough. It's just a very small group of people who care about this stuff. Every modern art critic says that Matisse and Picasso are the giants of the early 20th century. All of this shit, all of it is between about 1905 and 1912, just 7 years. I don't think any of this stuff is a Rembrandt or a Michelangelo, but yet all of the art that we're supposed to say is the most important, most beautiful stuff of the 20th century just comes out of this very short period.
Okay.
In 1912, Metzinger, who's the guy who did the Tea Time, the painting on the left, he writes a treatise on Cubism. You know, he mentions 10 artists like Cézanne, Picasso, Braque, himself, Derain, who was the guy who worked with Matisse, Leger, who we'll talk about in the next episode because he kind of inspires pop art, Andy Warhol stuff. You have Picabia and Duchamp, who are going to be part of the Dada movement, and like maybe 2 others. So again, these people can all sit around a table. Like the treatise on Cubism, the academic treatise that says what Cubism is supposed to be, mentions like 10 people. And these are the 10 people that make all of the other avant-garde movements. Like, that's just how few of these people there are. And also, because Metzinger is French, he has to include a passage on how Cubism is just like the recent discoveries in physics, like the recent discoveries of non-Euclidean geometry, which is like Einstein shit. But you know, that's the equivalent of like Carl Sagan talking about theories which your boomer uncle likes to talk about when he talks about quantum physics.
And Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah, exactly. The guy writes the book on Cubism, and yeah, he does the Neil deGrasse Tyson or Carl Sagan treatise on physics in there. So
the no math treatise.
Yes. Yes. All of the avant-garde is doing a crack at Cubism around 1910 or 1911. Here's like a whole bunch of these Cubist paintings. Like this is everybody's at least going to try 1 or 2 of these. The one on the top left is Picabia, who becomes a Dadaist.
What the hell is homie on the bottom left doing? That's suggestive.
I think that's actually supposed to be a portrait of Picasso.
Okay. It's accurate from what I've heard.
The art world is doing this stuff, But interestingly enough, Picasso and Brock, they've actually moved on to other things. Which again, just the first couple of people, they do something that everybody thinks is popular, then everybody needs to be like them.
Mm.
Like Nirvana gets famous, and then for a couple of years, everybody needs to do a grunge band. It's, again, same sort of stuff. But what are Picasso and Brock doing? I think they jumped the shark, and they're doing things like making collages. Like Brock does this. They call it synthetic cubism. It's like like the wax paper you put on shelves to stop them from getting scratched.
Oh, yeah.
Like that's what the brown stuff is here.
Jesus.
He's like cutting out a little bit of that wax paper or oil paper and pasting it to a piece of paper. Also, I just want to say, like, all this stuff that, when you were in grade 5 in arts and crafts, do a collage, boys and girls. This is like all the stuff that we're doing here.
Yeah.
It's like, again, they're doing this stuff called synthetic cubism. It's like, this is the equivalent of the punk band saying Black Lives Matter. It's just cringe.
Yeah.
Picasso does one called Still Life with Chair Caning, which takes the stuff off a chair, like, the wicker stuff on a chair, and pastes it on himself. I don't know.
It's drug addict stuff, man.
Like I said, Picasso and Brock are doing their own weird stuff like this, which, this is not the stuff that makes them famous. But the rest of the avant-garde decide that they need to do their own cubist movement. It's called the Section d'Or, or Les Puteaux. This is just like when Green Day makes it, and the entire Warped Tour becomes Green Day. Mm-hmm. That's, again, that reference dates us, I know, but I also don't give a shit.
Pop punk was an interesting phenomenon.
Punk was supposed to be, I have no ambition whatsoever, and then hardcore was supposed to be, I have no ambition whatsoever, and I'm going to scream my head off.
And punch people.
Like, that was done by about 1991.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, we'll do an episode on punk history. That actually wouldn't be a bad episode to do.
That'd be really interesting. Yeah. It's a very interesting genre.
Before we look at how World War I changes everything, just to be clear, Paris is not the only avant-garde in Europe, so we're just going to do a quick tour around Europe to see what the insufferable bohemians are doing in all the other major cultural centers. In hindsight, we call all this stuff movements, but just every city has a group of these weirdos who all copy each other, so it's just that after World War I, it becomes fashionable for the European elites to buy this stuff for a couple of years. So again, the eccentric rich guys who decide to collect some of this stuff, they make out like bandits.
Okay.
So,
like the early buyers of Bitcoin.
Yeah. Oh God, that too soon. Too soon. So the first place we go is to Germany. Now in Berlin and in Dresden, you have a group called Die Brücke, the bridge. Why do they call themselves that? It's from Nietzsche. It's from Thus Spake Zarathustra, where Nietzsche, he uses a bridge as a metaphor for humanity's potential. Says man is a rope fastened between animal and Übermensch, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. So yeah, that's what is said on the cover of their manifesto here. Now you'll realize one thing when we go through this stuff. Every one of these crazy groups, they have a manifesto about how all art up to this point is garbage, and we are the ones who know how to do it properly.
Jesus.
Like, all of these movements have this. The group's informal leader, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, he's the guy who writes this manifesto. When the boomers learned about this stuff in school, they thought it was deep to read about this stuff in a classroom, but in our generation, all this stuff is just like in older millennials' live journal or younger millennials' Tumblr, like talking about humanity as being a bridge to its full potential, like that.
I can't buy eggs.
Yeah.
What the hell are you talking about?
Once again, this is all just a bunch of middle-class people with a sense of self-loathing.
Yep.
In the manifesto, he says, "We call all the young people together, and as young people who carry the future in us, we want to wrest freedom for our actions and our lives from the older, comfortably established forces." this is just life-driven stuff. Or MySpace stuff. It's a call to youth and liberation. Well, what does the art actually look like? Again, just as when we looked at Matisse and the Blue Nude, you do see a bit of a sense of primitivism here. This is Kirchner doing the street in Dresden in 1908. Reduced to something without very much depth. I guess there is a little bit of depth, but he leans more on the dark lines of somebody like Gauguin than being something that realistic. Then a couple years later, he does the street Berlin. This is a little more angular. You have a bit more of the weird colors. You have more hard edges. This is what becomes later on known as German Expressionism, where you distort things for emotional effect. This is what we call German Expressionism. It's what Hitler called degenerate art and Tartetkunst.
And he was not a fan.
Well, the guy who did this painting and the last painting and the guy who did the manifesto, the Kirchner, yeah, he kills himself when this art gets banned in Germany. So, just so you know how devoted he is to his craft. I guess that's like German seppuku.
Yeah, they were big into that. The warrior caste of Germany is all about freaking German seppuku.
Yes, the artistic class was too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was Berlin. Then you have Munich. And so in Berlin you had Die Brücke, the bridge. In Munich you have Der Blaue Reiter, or the Blue Rider. They're a little less revolutionary. They don't have a manifesto per se, but they put out an almanac in 1912.
Lazy Bavarians.
Well, yeah, it contains essays like both on artistic theory and on like spiritualism and theodicy and all this shit. It contains the line, "We do not seek a program, only an inner necessity. The spirit is alive and demands its rights."
Just drink beer out of frickin' big stone frickin' cups, guys.
It's more collaborative in tone than confrontational like the Berlin people were. But they also get input from people like Schoenberg. He's one of the modern composers from the turn of the century, who was known for like doing stuff that was atonal, like not having a key, using every note on the piano keyboard.
Jesus Christ.
And like I said, they include stuff on theosophy and stuff. Like, who are these guys? The main character, he is Vasily Kandinsky, so he's not actually German himself. He's a Russian emigre. He has a bit of envy about these musicians. He says, musicians don't need to explain their music. Why should I have to explain my art? I actually kind of agree with that in theory, but I don't necessarily agree with that when you're doing like paint splashings on the page. That I do want an explanation for.
Show your work.
Yeah.
Show your work, guys.
Kandinsky starts calling his paintings improvisations, the same way as like musicians call their stuff improvisations.
That was the thing when I first moved to Toronto. Like they'd invite you to like come watch them paint.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Like an art thing. They'd have like, sometimes they'd call it a duet. They'd have like one of their friends who plays saxophone or piano, and they'd kind of paint the way. It was weird hipster stuff. Anyway.
All I'm trying to say is that this stuff is not original and has been done for a century.
Yep.
That's all I'm trying to say here. So what does Kandinsky do? This is the landscape with the factory chimney. Again, it's expressive. You could call it Fauvist. It uses a lot of weird colors. At this point, we now know enough about our history to say it's influenced by Cézanne, because there's no depth here. This is the cow.
More like the egg.
Yeah, I know. I was saying, you have to squint a bit to see the cow there, but you can kind of see the head on the right. Call it Fauvist. Call it Cézannish, because there's no real depth here. But again, this is the guy who says he doesn't want an explanation for his paintings. No, I want an explanation for this.
You need to explain this. I need something. I need something to go along with this.
But then in 1911, he decides to say, fuck it. If my art is not going to look realistic anyways, if my art if my paintings of a cow are not going to look anything like a cow, why am I even trying to make it look like a cow in the first place? So this is when the art world, call it abstract, call it non-figurative, call it whatever, where you just start painting shapes and shit on the page that's not supposed to be anything at all. This wasn't the first painting that he did like that, but this painting is kind of famous because he was working on it and he went out to take a walk or something. And when he came back, his assistant had hung it on the wall or put it on the easel or something and had accidentally turned it 90 degrees and said, oh, I like this more, turn 90 degrees. Now, I'm just going to say, if the artist himself is not sure how his painting should be oriented, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I want an explanation. That's all I'm saying. I want the explanation.
Yeah, I need to hear a very good explanation for some of this.
And then this is Composition 6 in 1913. This is when he has completely let go of any attempt to make it figurative or make it look realistic. This is colors and shapes. I don't know.
Looks like the Nothing from an Never-Ending Story.
The other thing he does, this one, squares with concentric circles.
This again looks like an album cover. I guess.
Like a piece of music, he says he just wants it to be form and color, and he calls it squares with concentric circles. It's a bunch of squares with concentric circles, so it's as advertised, I guess.
Yeah, he delivers what he says. I give him credit for that. This is better than that freaking cow painting. It didn't look like a cow.
The other guy in the movement, Franz Marc, or at least the other main guy.
Looks like a Romulan.
Yeah, I don't know if you played Super Mario 2 back in the day, but that looks like those masks that attack you when you grab the key.
Yep. Yeah, good reference. 100%.
Again, it's Fauvist. It has the weird color palette. Again, there's no depth there. So this whole idea of making paintings with any perspective, it seems to be going away, at least as far as the avant-garde is concerned. It's supposed to be more spiritual than expressive, at least according to his own writings. But you can also clearly see that he was influenced by Picasso's masks. Like Picasso decided to do people's faces based on a mask. He's clearly doing the same thing himself.
Vaguely Cubist.
Well, the masks were before Cubism.
Oh.
He did the masks first, and I guess that first painting of the Demoiselles d'Avignon was mask-like / Cubism, but really him doing the stuff with the masks was 1906.
Oh.
There are so few of these people that you can actually nerd out on stuff like dates. That doesn't work now when every city has 4 universities full of insufferable people trying to make their own art and explain why it's important. When there's 30 of these people all across Europe, you can nerd out and follow them and say, okay, this guy must have affected that guy because that was in 1899 and that was in 1902. The fact that you can even tell that story just tells you how few of these people are.
I'm just glad we finally have a picture of a cow that looks like a cow.
Yeah.
Or a bull. Well, no, cow. Those are others.
Well, this is called the yellow cow because it's a yellow cow. Again, it's Fauvist. It's. Oh God! Art historians in 100 years are going to be talking about Sonnenschein as being.
They are. It's going to be like.
Christian is going to be the tortured Vincent van Gogh genius.
Yep. It's already starting. People are paying out the ass for his artwork, and he's got handlers, and it's really a strange story. Mm-hmm. Don't Google it. Do yourself a favor.
This is the deer in the forest. So like I said, these people, they all take a crack at Cubism when it becomes the rage in avant-garde circles. It just becomes the rage for a couple of years, but every one of these avant-garde painters seems to have one Cubist painting in his catalog, and here's his Cubist painting.
Okay.
Again, looks like he broke it apart into a bunch of little pieces and then glued all the pieces together on a page. That's... What else does he do? He does the woodcutter.
There we go. Finally.
Again, the French don't paint male nudes, but the Germans do.
There we go.
So, draw your own conclusions about that.
God bless the Germans.
Yeah, here you see a bit of cubism. You also see Cezanne, where he broke everything down into the cubes and the cones and the spheres and the geometric shapes. I think he had that quote: "Everything can be broken down into the sphere, the cone, and the cylinder."
Well, especially this guy.
Well, yeah. There's at least one cylinder on there.
Yep.
Yeah, so Cubism, Fauvism, and Cezanne. Now when you start looking at all of this early 20th century avant-garde art, again, you can start seeing these people influencing each other, but only because there's not that many of them.
And all fit around the table.
Mm-hmm. World War I happens. Half the Blue Rider group gets killed in battle, including Franz Marc, the guy who does this.
So it goes.
Kandinsky goes back to Russia. That's that. That's that for the Blue Rider movement. So we had Die Bruck in Berlin. We had the Blue Rider in Munich. Now we go to Milan, where you have a guy named Marinetti. He's another rich kid who publishes a manifesto in a prestigious Paris newspaper, probably because he had daddy's money to do that. And this manifesto is a little more over the top. In fact, I think it's intentionally nuts. He says that in the newly industrialized society with the, quote, holy halo of electricity, he and his friends were inspired to race their cars around the streets, crashing them and deciding they needed to renew everything. So again, this is the optimism about technology changing society shortly before World War I, when society was changed by this technology, but not in the way everybody wanted.
Nope. Especially the machine gun.
So again, in 2025, a hyper-industrial society sounds miserable. In 1909, this idea of a land full of factories is just like, oh my God, the future's upon us. The idea of living in Robocop sounded wonderful to these people.
We'll have enough things for once.
Again, the Soviet Revolution, it's a few years later, and it kind of comes out of this same industrial enthusiasm, probably much more so than the writings of Karl Marx. And in fact, the Americans, they are extra excited to see this technology creating a utopia, especially when it's going to be the Russians sacrificing for it, not them.
There's a horrifying history of people turning a blind eye to some of the things that were going on in the Soviet Union.
The manifesto, these people, they call themselves the futurists, but it's just a bunch of utopian points. I think there's like 11 points. It's the love of danger and risk is a vital force. It's that art needs to be subversive. It needs to glorify speed. Race car is more beautiful than a Greek statue. You reject the past. You tear down museums and libraries. War is hygiene. Yeah, they're going to change their opinion on that a couple years later. You have to worship machines, and art needs to be violent. We're going to deliver Italy from this gangrene of professors and archaeologists and tour guides and antiquaries that make Italy a second-hand market. If you were going to university in 1955, this might have seemed edgy and revolutionary. We grew up with our friends in LiveJournal. Yeah. This is nothing that I didn't hear attention cutters doing in 2001.
Yeah, every school had a bunch of these kids who are going to reform society.
Now that we're in our 40s, let's check back in on these kids. Have any of them reformed society?
Nope.
Some of them have a job, I'll give them that.
Some of them have successfully completed rehab.
So, yeah, the other thing they say in the manifesto is we're in our 20s, and by the time we're in our 40s, hopefully the next generation will throw us away too.
Jesus, what was that? Logan's Run?
Yeah. Okay. This stuff is not shocking now. Just again, listen to the spoiled black girl whining about how hard she has it. That's exactly what this is. The Futurist Manifesto, it only works in a world where every trust fund kid doesn't have access to a blog. So you don't just have the Futurist Manifesto, then some chick writes the Manifesto of the Futurist Woman. And it's just indistinguishable from the most mediocre feminist slam poetry you've ever heard.
What year is this?
1909.
There we go. Okay. Wow.
Nothing new. Over a century old.
Before World War One. Wow.
World War I comes in and changes these people's attitude on whether we should be glorifying war. Yeah, the futurist movement is something that is very abruptly ended when the Archduke gets shot.
No more future.
What does this chick write in her Manifesto of the Futurist Woman? She says, humanity is mediocre. The majority of women are neither superior nor inferior to the majority of men. They are all equal. They merit the same scorn. So this is just Sylvia Plath shit.
Yeah.
At least Sylvia Plath had the courtesy to go out. Nowadays, this girl would be the chick in the burlesque troupe with sharp elbows who looks like a ketamine addict. That's just the image I get.
The belle of the ball? Was that burlesque troupe?
The one with the really, really short haircut.
Oh, yeah.
The one who plays Yitzhak in the local production of Hedwig and the
There we
Ranch.
go. Yeah, that's the type.
Yeah, she's playing roller derby. She'd have a Buffy the Vampire Slayer tattoo.
And a Harry Potter tattoo that she's gotten covered up.
Yep. Oh yeah, no, she would have been shocked to find out that Joss Whedon was just pretending to be a feminist to get laid.
Yep.
I think you've come up with this expression. You'd say she's daddy's a CEO levels of oppressed.
Levels of pressure, oppression that shouldn't even be possible.
Yeah, she says that women must embrace a superwoman ideal equal to men in their capacity for heroism and violence. Femininity needs to be primal and barbaric so that distinctions between men and women dissolve. Nothing new. All this bullshit comes out of the fact that women can now work on the factory line, so that transhumanists think that shifts in the factory are going to finally make men and women the same.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It's not, people don't understand biology.
No, they don't. But they're also not original.
Yeah.
Middle class creative society is just in an auto loop. I'm just discovering this. Like, it started the second there was a middle class. We have not moved 1 inch past it. And again, the middle class is going away.
It was a nice little experiment.
Yeah. It's good for making society run. It's just not good for creating original art. That's something I've discovered. Anyways, what was the art that the futurists were making? It's all about speed to look like a photograph with multiple exposures. So this is a guy named Giacomo Balla. It's called Dinamismo di un cane al guinzaglio, or Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash. You know, kind of looks like, I don't know, the Roadrunner.
Yeah.
You started seeing motion lines in newspaper cartoons at the time as well. So people aren't actually sure whether these guys came first or the newspaper cartoons came first. What else comes out of it? The girl running on a balcony. Here you see the pointillist divisionism again. But again, this is supposed to be as if you were snapping a camera with a bunch of exposures on the same piece of film. You see feet at the bottom. It's a famous picture, folks. I don't get to choose what's famous. You have a guy named Umberto Boccioni who does a sequence of paintings called The States of Mind. So you can kind of see a train pulling into the station on the right-hand side. The number 6943 is the number on the train. This is the first State of Mind painting. It's called The Farewell. You kind of see the couple hugging through the train window on the far right there.
Okay.
And then on the left, you see the train pulling out of the station and the one person staying on the platform. So again, it's you're introducing the element of time into these paintings, but you're not doing it in terms of panels. You're reducing it all to one image, as if the camera had multiple exposures. All this stuff is affected by relatively new technology, including photography. The next painting is called Those Who Go. This is supposed to be the people who were on the train leaving the station, feeling a bit melancholy about leaving their friends and family behind, and a little uncertain about what's coming in the future. And then, so this was called Those Who Go. The last one was called Those Who Stay. Like, these are the people who stay behind when their friends get on the train and move to the city or something.
Something to fields, or what the hell?
I'm not actually sure what they're supposed to be doing, but it's just like the people on the train platform who are depressed.
Okay.
I think there's definitely some aesthetic value here with the last couple of paintings. Again, you see the cubism here. This is in 1911. This is when every avant-garde painter across Europe is trying his hand at cubism. Even the futurists who are trying to do their own new style of art, they have to try cubism as well.
Okay.
Going back to Die Bruck, this is the German expressionists in Berlin. They start doing paintings like this, and you can clearly see the futurists affecting them. On the left you have Potsdamer Platz, and on the right you see Friedrichstrasse. These are both paintings by Kirchner, again the guy who decides he has nothing to live for after Hitler bans his art. They're clearly mugging for the critics and the academics, despite that manifesto saying that they hate academics. It's just, again, all these people are your classic trust fund kids who hate their parents. That's all this is. So we've gone to Berlin, we've gone to Munich, we've gone to Milan. Now we go to Moscow. And again, we have a small avant-garde group with a crazy guy who writes a manifesto. His name is Kazimir Malevich. Some of his quotes: "I have transformed myself in the zero of form." You'll see very shortly what he means by the zero of form. "I understand the supremacy of pure feeling in creative art. We have nothing to do with the painting of yesterday, nor with the painting of tomorrow." He also talks a lot about squares. What does he mean by the zero of form? This is a painting called The Black Square.
Oh, shit.
It's a black square. He argues this is the most realistic painting ever made because he says it's a painting of a black square, and it's a black square.
I guess. Seems like cheating.
Seems like somebody trying to see what he can get away with. This is 1915 that this happened, so I guess the war is technically started. But remember, we talked about how in 1883, the guy, as a joke, submitted the all-white painting, and then the all-black one called Negroes Fighting in a Cave at Night. Interestingly enough, when they x-rayed this painting, just to be clear, he's not stylizing, that's just the paint cracked. That's why it's not solid black anymore.
It's poorly made, like many things in Russia.
But when they x-rayed the canvas of this painting, he actually wrote that title. He wrote Negroes Fighting in a Cave at Night underneath this. So he was at least aware of the fact that it wasn't original. But yeah, his argument, I'm saying this is a painting of a black square, and it's a painting of a black square. And this is what he meant by reducing art to the 0 degree. This, to me, is just somebody who's up his own ass about his theories.
Yeah, it's just kind of come full circle back to nonsense and not art. Like,
he says that some beautiful oil painting is a lie. I mean, I guess he's being honest when he says that.
I mean, it is an oil painting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not.
Like, I don't disagree with his logic, just that it's fucking pointless.
Well, we might have had a little bit of the tism.
No, Walter, you're not wrong. You're just a fucking asshole. Again, more importantly, that the banana duct tape to the wall. If this was being done in 1915, don't tell me that the banana duct tape to the wall is any different than this.
This is like the same silly joke, taken too far.
You know, like I said, I can at least give Malevich the credit for having the chutzpah to do this when it was original. I'll give him that. The banana guy's 110 years too late. What else does Malevich do? This kind of stuff. The one on the right is called Suprematist Composition. Because again, he calls his art movement suprematism. And the one on the left is called 8 Red Rectangles. It's 8 red rectangles. Again, this is the kind of art that gets banned when the communists come in, because they don't trust a guy who comes up with all these weird academic theories.
It didn't take a lot to get you put in the gulag. This is definitely going to get you put in the gulag. So it's funny, Hitler and Stalin both declared this art.
That was Lenin, not Stalin, but still.
Pardon me, thank you. But both communists and fascists took a stab at wiping this out.
Now, in Amsterdam, technically speaking, this is in 1917 and really takes off in 1920, so it's not pre-World War I, but spiritually it kind of fits into everything we're talking about. This is called neoplasticism or de style. We talked a bit about this in our first episode. So what happened was Mondrian, he was one of these avant-garde artists in Paris. Again, if you go back to our first How Art Got Ugly episode, we go through his whole progression. He does an impressionist painting, he does an expressionist painting, he does a fauvist painting, he does a cubist painting. So, he's trying to make a name for himself, at least in the avant-garde scene, by playing all the greatest hits. Every artist we're talking about does that whole progression. He goes home to visit his father in 1914, and the war breaks out. And this isn't World War II. In World War I, the Netherlands is a neutral country. So he decides he doesn't want to risk going back to Paris. He decides he likes living in a country that's not at war. During the war in Amsterdam, I think it's actually technically in one of the towns near Amsterdam, they say, okay, if cubism is breaking everything into these geometric cubes and facets, why not just reduce it to 2 dimensions and make everything straight lines and just primary colors? We will talk a bit about this in the next episode when we talk about the 20th century, because this inspires a lot of design decisions, minimalist design decisions in architecture and shit. But I just kind of needed to bring this up because this is, at least spiritually, in the same vein as the guy who does the black square and the cubists and the futurists. But technically speaking, this is not pre-World War I, this is post-World War I. That brings us to the great turning point. In the first episode of the art series, we narrowed it down. We said that art got ugly and quite frankly became meaningless in the 60-year period between World War I and 1973. We looked at Octavio Paz's book, The Children of the Mire, where he described modern art as being ugly and pointless for the exact same reasons we see today. So we narrowed it down to World War I to 1973. To foreshadow a bit at the back end of the war, in the 1920s, it's every bit as much of a landmark cultural decade as the 1960s. Just think of all the literature from English class you had to read, and a lot of it comes from the 20s, like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Joyce and Pound and T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, like all these people, they're from the 1920s. And it just kind of seems like the 1920s is when all the classic literature stops. It seems like the last hurrah for it. Again, it's not just literature. You have the playwrights. You have Eugene O'Neill and Bertolt Brecht and like 6 Characters in Search of an Author and Phantom of the Opera and all this stuff. You have composers like Stravinsky, who did stuff like changing his rhythms. You have Schoenberg, he's the guy we talked about, who used all the notes on the piano keyboard. You have people like Ravel's Bolero, you have Debussy, Prokofiev. Architecture starts becoming more minimalistic and geometric. Modern dance, where you have the anorexic girls flopping on the floor, Martha Graham, that comes out of the 20s as well. So and you have films like Metropolis and Birth of a Nation and Battleship Potemkin. All this shit comes out of the 1920s and kind of feels like a different world. Like the 1950s and 60s, they feel before my time, but I kind of feel like there's continuity like the 1950s don't feel like a different world. You know, Buddy Holly became the Beatles, became the shit that my parents listened to. But like the jazz age, Ernest Hemingway, he almost feels foreign to me. I don't know. I at least feel that way. The 20s feel like the before times.
Yeah.
The same way that if you could go back thousands of years in the British Isles, you know, you might feel some continuity with the medieval kings and maybe even with the Romans, but Stonehenge feels like something different. Stonehenge feels like it's a different world. The 20s feel the same way, at least to me. If you got famous right after World War I, you're studied in university right alongside the rest of the Western canon. And after the 20s, the canon might as well be dead. But this is not just like academic shit. It's something that there's an actual taste and organic demand for. Like for a few years after World War I, everybody wanted to read Hemingway and read Fitzgerald. There was taste for saying, you know what, we live in an industrialized, mechanized world, so maybe our media and art shouldn't have to conform to the old rules. This means a couple of things. The first is that you have a bunch of people trained in the classical methods who are deciding to break the rules, so you know they could write a classical symphony but then do weird musical stuff with it. You had people who could write Victorian poetry but then decided to do weird T.S. Eliot, you know, free verse. You know, you had melodramatic theater, which became like Eugene O'Neill or Breaking the Fourth Wall, all this weird stuff. But these are people who could all do things the proper way. They were just intentionally breaking the rules, as opposed to now, people I think just don't know how to do the things the proper way in the first place. The second thing is that you have this narrative about the artists and the creatives having more freedom to break the rules as time goes on. We talked last time about how that was kind of bullshit anyways, just like Revolutionary France's art was more academic and Spain's monarchist art was the one taking more liberties. That whole narrative kind of hinges on the 1920s. The 20s are kind of an inflection point, and in some sense the creative energy that started in the Romantic era starts to run out. Like the culture that drove the Victorian age is going to become something of the past. Victorian poetry is just going to be something you put on a greeting card. And if you want to keep doing that kind of writing or that kind of art, you can, but it's now a bit of a LARP, a bit of a pastiche. So the third thing we see is that just why this art that we've been talking about, it starts to sell. Because the academic art was always for high society and the establishment, and this avant-garde shit was always for a small group of eccentric new money, usually with a sense of self-loathing. Well, in the 1920s, the entire bourgeois class gets a taste for this art, and all of it becomes popular in Europe. Your Van Goghs, your Gauguins, your Bernards, Cézanne, Signac, Seurat, Matisse, Kandinsky, Mondrian, Picasso, all of it, but just for a few years. So this whole story I've just gotten through, it becomes the story of art history when Ernest Hemingway and James Joyce become part of the canon. They become part of the school curriculum. The other thing that's relatively new at the time in the 20s is mass media. At the end of the war, this is when Picasso is really going to become a celebrity. Why? Because he designs the sets and costume for the Ballet Russe. Now, what is the Ballet Russe? This isn't 2025 when ballet is just something that spoiled girls and gay guys do. The ballet is an important cultural institution in the 20s, and the Ballet Russe is a famous traveling ballet that's based in Paris. It was started by a Russian guy named Dagyev. And, you know, if you were doing stuff in the Ballet Russe, you were almost like a Hollywood actor or at least a Broadway actor in those days. You'd made a name for yourself. And the first year after the war is over, Picasso gets hired to make a bunch of these weird sets for the ballet and costumes. I don't know what the fuck these costumes are supposed to be. The one in the bottom right is these costumes in a museum, but like, what kind of drugs do you have to do to make the one on the left?
Hallucinogens.
Yeah. I don't know if that's supposed to be like the guys dressed like New York City before a plane hit him. I don't know. So, he becomes a celebrity when he's almost 40 because of this commission he gets from the Ballet Russe, not because of any of the art that he did. For all we talk about, Mr. Cubist changed the art world. Nobody would have given a shit about Picasso if he hadn't gotten hired by the big ballet in Paris. So this goes to show one thing that we'll very much see when we look at the 20th century. It's all driven by the institutions. We like to talk about how artists are all breaking the rules, but really now everything is becoming institutionalized, even more so than before. But like I said before, he essentially becomes a caricature of himself after he becomes famous. Like, he's not going to be creating new and weird artistic movements where he paints cubes or pastes wax paper into a collage anymore. He's just going to start doing all this weird stuff as a crowd pleaser. He dies in 1972, which isn't even that long ago, and that's kind of emblematic because he does all of his art that we know about between 1907 and 1910. He lives for another 62 years after that, and nobody gives a shit about any of the stuff he does, other than this one commission for the ballet. He's kind of like Orson Welles in Citizen Kane. Orson Welles does Citizen Kane when he's 24, and what has Orson Welles done since then?
Pee commercials.
He was in the Transformers movie.
Yeah, he was the voice of Omicron.
A Unicron. But that's the post-World War I world, which we'll be looking at next time. When the war breaks out, all this weird art that we've been talking about in Paris and Berlin and Munich and Milan, it all comes to an abrupt end. A lot of these artists, like Franz Marc, they die in the war. But in Switzerland, in another neutral country, a small group of artists go to Zurich to flee the war. And this is where every art history book talks about Dada as a turning point. And Dada is what we're going to end this episode on. So what is Dada? Our next episode starts at the end of World War I, so we'll be talking about the Dadaists and the Surrealists in the 20s when they move to Berlin and really see what they can get away with to really piss off the establishment. That absolutely gets labeled degenerate a couple decades later.
It becomes very dangerous to piss off the establishment in the coming decades.
But something important happens during the war, or at least something that becomes part of the narrative. Now, the thing about Dada is that a lot of things get confused on the timeline. We think of the Dadaists as being this group of weirdos who do this absurd conceptual shit, and at some point a guy sticks a urinal into an art gallery and it changes art forever. The way it's usually described is that it happens independently in Zurich and New York, and then after the war it moves to Berlin and Paris and becomes the latest in a long string of avant-garde movements. Well, you know how when you get a group of creatives, nothing ever gets accomplished without the one guy who's maybe not that creative, but he actually doesn't have ADD, so he founds the community theater company and produces things. But that guy himself is fairly straight-laced, and when it gets successful, you get all the drama and the politics and the hysterical women and the rich kids buying overpriced tickets. That guy who organizes it, his name's Hugo Ball.
Oh.
Hugo Ball is a middle-class kid. He goes to school. He's good with art and literature. In his 20s, he moves to the city. He hangs out with the artists. He writes a few things, acts in a couple of plays, but is otherwise living a pretty mundane life. The story of my 20s, in other words. He's 28 when the war breaks out. He moves to Switzerland, and for 6 months he runs a variety show at a venue called the Cabaret Voltaire, where people just do weird shit. Now, he does it for 6 months. He does it as an outlet for his frustrations over the war. Then he gets a job as a journalist and moves on with life. So yeah, we talk about Dada like it's this earth-shattering movement that changes all of art. It really should have just been a little community theater project that was over in a couple of months. But for 109 years, this was 1916, it's now 2025. For 109 years, Every single creative who thinks he's trying to subvert norms is not creative at all. They're just trying to be this Hugo Ball guy. Every drag queen, every fat tattooed burlesque dancer named Flex Luthor who thinks that stripping is a way to show off feminine beauty. Every art installation that looks like a junk pile, but the program says it raises marginalized voices.
The Paris Olympics opening ceremony.
Yep, that. Every alternative comedian who needs a positive space because she can't deal with hecklers.
Sad.
All of these people are just knockoffs of the Dadaist movement, and they all want to be Hugo Ball. All of them. Every piece of shit who thinks that graffiti is some sort of deep social commentary. All of these people. Every experimental band where their lead singer is screaming his head off.
Nice.
Every slam poet. Every shitty movie whose director is raising awareness. Every skinny fat mutant who dresses like shit and calls it queer visibility. And to be honest, every land acknowledgement where some homely chick who never got hit on in high school and just wants her moment in the spotlight, all of it is just a LARP of the Cabaret Voltaire. Or else something that comes immediately after it. But everything that came immediately after it, they were largely LARPing Cabaret Voltaire. So what was it? He says that he wanted it to be an experimental art space where they do nothing that reminds them of the pre-war world. So what do? They do like absurdist poetry readings, like slam poetry. Musical improvisation that was largely just noise and whistles and people banging pots.
Oh, they love that shit because they don't have to rehearse.
Yep. Puppet shows.
Yeah, there we go. They love puppet shows.
Yep. A lot of it was just these artsy kids getting drunk. A lot of it was alcohol fueled. So this is a famous picture of Hugo Ball where he dresses up in this ridiculous outfit.
This is a man who I don't think ever had his head in the toilet.
Yeah.
It's a guy who needed to be bullied.
Like I said, he does this for a couple of months. He gathers all the weird people in his cabaret, and then after a couple of months, he just fucks off and gets a job as a journalist.
He's like the Howard Stern with the whack pack.
Yeah, kind of. Every theater kid has done something like this at theater camp. Like, nothing original. But on July 14th, 1916, he gets on stage and he reads the Dada Manifesto. And again, it sounds like every pretentious middle-class drama teacher, but it's kind of original in 1916. The word gentleman is a public concern of the first important. The word outside your domain, your stuffiness, the laughable impotence, your stupendous smugness, outside all of the paratree of your self-evident limitedness. Why can't a tree be called plooch and plupash when it's been raining? Why shouldn't I find it? This is
a guy who I get it. We make certain assumptions. Just leave him alone.
Yeah, again, every undergrad has come across something like that. You know, who else do you have in the movement? You got Art, who does these weird decorations and woodcuts. He also does something called chance collages, where he tears things up, drops them on the floor, and pastes them to the canvas wherever they land. Fine, you know, you want to give a middle finger to the people who started World War I can understand that, but
at a certain point, you're just doing drugs.
You have Marcel Janko. He does like arts and crafts amateur hour as well. He makes these cardboard masks of like rats and fetuses, and again, just to prove that there's absolutely nothing new going on with modern avant-garde art, he makes masks of lesbian sardines.
Wow. Yeah. If you told me that was out of 2015, I would believe that.
Well, and these shitty things, they're all in museums now. That's how much people view the Dada movement as just like a groundbreaking moment in creativity. Like, you probably find this piece of shit cardboard mask in a museum somewhere. Tristan Tzara, he is the guy who can't start anything, but as it's going, he's the guy who needs to be in charge. He does stuff like fridge magnet poetry, where he cuts apart a newspaper article and says, I'm going to make a poem by taking all of these words and putting them in a random order. it makes you original, and the vulgar can't understand you.
Yeah, that was a thing they had. Fridge magnet. I would
Yep.
see that on every
Yep.
intellectuals.
Comes out of the Dada movement. Not even the Dada movement, just comes out of this one shitty cabaret in Zurich, Switzerland. Hugo Ball, like I said, after a couple months, he gets his writing job and he disappears. And this Tristan Tzara guy, because even then these people don't have any original ideas, he, instead of coming up with something new with this group of artists, he decides he just needs to be the new leader of the Dada movement. And he writes another manifesto, because again, these people can't be original. And he just writes about destroying everything that's come before. Or this is just like a real professor who likes the smell of his own farts. He says, this need itself is obsolete. In documenting art on the basis of the supreme simplicity, novelty, we are human and true for the sake of amusement, impulsive, vibrant to crucify boredom. At the crossroads of the lights, alert, attentively waiting the years in the forest, I write a manifesto, and I want nothing. Yet I say certain things, and in principle I am against manifestos, as I am also against principles. Half pints to measure the moral value of every phrase too convenient. Approximation was invented by the Impressionists.
It's something I would have freaking wrote when I was fucking 16.
Yeah, it's like, I'm writing a manifesto, though I don't need to. And it's the whole thing is just him saying we've run out of ideas. He talks about the psychoanalysts and he talks about the bourgeoisie, but it just ends on something interesting. It ends on him saying, the artist, the poet, rejoice at the venom of the masses condensed into a section chief of this industry. He is happy to be insulted. It is a proof of his immutability. When a writer or artist is praised by the newspapers, it is proof of the intelligibility of his work. Wretched lining of a coat for public use, tatters covering brutality, piss contributing to the warmth of an animal brooding vile instincts, flabby, insipid flesh reproducing with the help of typographical microbes. Bougie art is meaningless. Yeah.
We get it, buddy.
Yeah. You know, it's only 5 pages long. If you want to understand what modern art professors think is deep, just read it. But again, what Ball's manifesto, it was a bit whimsical. This is just total I hate my parents. But he also name drops a couple of artists just because he needs to prove that he's actually cultured. It's a bit of Nietzsche's nihilism about how Cézanne and Cubism and Futurism allowed us to look at things from different angles simultaneously. And so does philosophy. So philosophy must be as useless as the last 30 years of art. And this art shows us how useless logic is. And then he goes on to talk about how art was always thought to contain a truth, but now we know there's no truth and there's no point in art except if the artist makes it for himself. Fine, but you avant-garde pieces of shit were the ones who wanted to sell it to collectors directly, so what are you bitching about? Yeah. He uses a lot of scatological language. There's 1 or 2 analogies to gonorrhea, because of course there are. Yep. I'm sure it was edgy when they were just selling modernism to the boomers, but to our generation and especially to the Zoomers, I'm sure this shit is just old.
You can't shock me. I grew up on Internet 1.
Yeah. I mean, what was Jello Biafra doing but repeating this shit?
He asked me for money once.
Yeah, we'll go through that stories. Yeah, it was like, because he said, I need money to sue my bandmates,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
It was a grift.
Anyway, so Tzara, he talks about how the bourgeois have tainted the purity of the creatives, and now it's time to destroy centuries of art, philosophy, morality, sentimentality, logic, hierarchies, yada, 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 because everything has to be spontaneous. Every shitty piece of modern art that represents the struggle of the Aboriginal community or looks like it was thrown together in 17 seconds, it's the fact that the arbiters of taste in the modern world find this shit to be deep. That's another piece of the puzzle that's sliding into place. So just
found a nucleus.
Yep. So some of the Dadaists, they go to Germany, and Weimar Germany is a great place to be an untalented creative and a degenerate attention whore. What comes after Weimar is not quite so much.
Reactionary.
But, you know, we'll look at Berlin Dada and Paris Dada next time when we look at the 20th century, or at least we look at post-World War I. But the avant-garde is just no longer going to try to make serious art at all, and it's all going to be spectacle. Later on, they try to be more serious as they try to turn it into surrealism, and the art we've been looking at starts to go mainstream. You get stuff like Art Deco, but at some point, Dada just becomes a template for every creative endeavor that just needs to send a message. So again, this story is constructed after the fact, but there's one piece of it that I just need to talk about, and that's the urinal. What's the story of the urinal?
Oh, fuck this.
It's usually called New York Dada. I mean, it isn't. It's three guys who later moved to Paris after the war to join Paris Dada, two of whom were French anyways, just fleeing the war.
Draft dodgers.
Yeah, basically. They were just in New York City to get as far away as they could. There's Man Ray, who was a photographer. He was the American one. There's Picabia, who we mentioned earlier. He does things like splashing paint on a canvas and then erasing it after. But most importantly, you have Marcel Duchamp. So who is Marcel Duchamp? He's like all of these avant-garde fuckers he's good at painting, so he does some Fauvism, some Cubism. But in 1913, New York hosts something called the Armory Show. Now, every art book talks about the Armory Show like it's some sort of a cataclysmic event, like it's the first time all this crazy art gets introduced to America, other than like the art at Stieglitz's gallery, that 291, which we talked about last time. But, this is the first time Van Gogh and Cézanne and Matisse and even some of the older artists like Delacroix and Manet get introduced to an American audience. And again, strictly speaking, it's true that it makes waves, but it's not like the show was full of stuff that was meant to shock the audience either. Like, if you look at the Picasso work that were displayed at the Armory Show, they were all fairly tame. But the thing about the Armory Show is that the floor plan snaked around, and the last room was the room full of Cubist paintings. And like I said, Cubist paintings was not Picasso. Cubist paintings was, at this point, every French artist had one or two of them. The Cubist room got called, I think, the Chamber of Horrors. So the painting that makes the most headlines is this one. It's called Nude Descending the Stairs. It's both Cubist and Futurist. Like, you see the motion and you see everything broken apart into shapes. I don't think anybody likes it per se, but it does get written about in the New York Times, so that's as good as being famous when you're in the art world. So it's in New York, even though Duchamp is still in Paris at the time, this painting just gets shipped over to New York for the Armory Show. Duchamp gets known as that guy. He gets known as the guy who did whatever the fuck this thing is. Back in Paris, now that he's done with Cubism, so this is like 1913, 1914, he has a new idea. He's going to do something called the objet trouvé, or the ready-made, or the found object. Things like a bicycle wheel or a bottle rack. And he's just going to say, okay, I found this object. It's a work of art.
You know who was talking about that the other day? Andy Dick. On live stream. Oh. He found some guy. He does like live streams now, like for like penny dancing for pennies, basically, is what the guy's doing. And he brought a bunch of garbage inside the house he's staying in, the streamer house, and he told everybody it's found art.
Yeah, again, nothing original. Nothing original. Yeah, and I think, like, Duchamp is just like the Sacha Baron Cohen of his time. He just wants to see what he can get away with.
That's the Borat.
Yeah. Or like maybe an Andy Kaufman figure. So the war breaks out, and he says, you know what? At least people know who I am in New York. They know I'm the guy who did this thing. So here's a couple of the cartoons that appear in the newspaper after the Armory Show. And the one in the middle, like, lest we think that art has just gotten ugly now, this is a cartoon from 1913. It's titled "How to Become a Post-Impressionist Paint Slinger." It just shows a guy tossing paint on the canvas. So even in the 1910s, people were joking about this shit. The one in the top left, it's titled At an Exhibition of Cubist or Futurist Pictures, and the caption is "Perhaps it's a map of the Balkan Mountains." And the one on the right, it's called "The Rude Descending a Staircase, Rush Hour at the New York Subway."
I like that one.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a send-up of that Cubist painting that I just showed. Anyways, Duchamp is now known as that guy in New York, the guy who did whatever the fuck that painting was.
You're the worst artist I've ever heard of.
Yeah.
But you have heard of me.
Yeah, exactly. And when the war breaks out, he says, you know what? I should go to New York. And he goes to New York. He meets these other two. He meets Man Ray and Picabia, and they New York avant-garde, who they're at least talking about pretentious shit, like how the whole idea of art is over. They hang out at Stieglitz's art gallery, but you gotta remember, art in America is still fairly academic at this point. So there's a group called the Society of Independent Artists who decide they want to have an unjuried show that you don't need to have a bunch of professors signing off on before your art gets exhibited. Duchamp sits on the board of this organization, and then under a fake name, he submits a urinal twisted on its side. I'm not going to pretend that there's any women who are not a member of my family or who were in a relationship watching this podcast, but in case you are, a urinal is not usually oriented that way.
No, that would be counterproductive.
He just submits a urinal that he bought from a hardware store under the pseudonym R. Mutt. I think there was a plumbing company called R. Mott, so it's just him being Borat. It's him being Sacha Baron Cohen. And the Society of Independent Artists, they said they would accept anything for the art show, but they're not going to accept a urinal. They agreed to accept anything, so they put the urinal in the gallery, but behind a wall. So in protest, Duchamp resigns from the board.
There we go.
And also, an avant-garde magazine, on which Duchamp is also on the editorial board of that, starts writing articles defending the idea of putting a urinal in the art gallery. Whether Mr. Mutt, with his own hands, made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view. He created a new thought for the object. All right.
Why can't, groups, you think of all that beautiful Mesopotamian art that was destroyed during that dust up in the Middle East? Why can't they destroy this? Why can't they fucking hammer this fucking thing?
The thing is, the art crowd actually fucking talks like this now. In 1916, he was doing this as a joke. Another article called "The Buddha of the Bathroom" in the same publication called it a lovely form and compared it to a Michelangelo sculpture. It also said that the only art that America has given the world are its plumbing and its bridges.
Jesus Christ.
Anyways, it's a stunt. It gets forgotten about. But after the war, his friends invite him to Paris to be part of the mainstream Dada movement that takes place from about 1919 to 1922. And in Paris, he does shit like drawing a goatee on the postcard of the Mona Lisa. Banksy, you're talented, but you're not original. He calls this LHOOQ, or in French, LHOOQ. She has a hot ass.
Oh, God. Face.
He dresses in drag and has pictures taken of his alter ego, Eros C'est la vie.
There we go.
So again, this is just like, drag is not original. There's nothing that is done to be shocking after about 1922 that was not done before 1922.
Okay.
He jokes that it's easier to change my sex than to stop being Catholic. I'll say that's a bit clever. I will say that. He makes a mechanical sculpture called rotary glass plates, and then when he's demonstrating it to an audience, he smashes it.
Okay, yeah, Sacha Baron Cohen.
Or Banksy,
destroying the thing. Yeah.
He even comes up with the term conceptual art as opposed to retinal art. he's just seeing what he can get away with.
Yeah, this is.
You know, the Dada movement disbands around 1922. Like I said, maybe surrealism is semi-new as far as the spectacle stuff goes, but that's it. There's nothing new after 1922. And like I said, part of it is that the arbiters of what is or isn't art won't allow there to be anything new. But like when you get Andy Warhol in 1960s, pop art, they don't know what to call it at first, so they call it Neo-Dada.
Oh, okay.
So again, in the next episode, we need to take a look at what goes on after 1922. But just to put a button on Duchamp, you look at the ultimate attention whore, Andy Kaufman, the guy, you know, the intergender wrestling champion.
I had to cut him out of the pro wrestling episode, and it was very, very hard to do that. He was arguably very important in that story.
Well, a lot of people wondered when Andy Kaufman died, is he going to have some sort of elaborate scheme? You know, is it going to turn out that he faked his death? Is there going to be some stunt when he died? Duchamp does that.
Jesus
Again,
Christ.
This is how it's all like in an auto loop. So after being this professional mischief-making troll, he fades away and decides to give up art and devote the rest of his life to playing chess and living quietly in his New York apartment.
Bobby Fischer.
Yeah, basically. He says he's finished with art. When he dies, they go to clean out his apartment, and they realize that a room he never let anyone into is an elaborate diorama of a naked woman that you have to look at through a peephole. So, you know, he told everybody he was finished with art, and then when he dies, they find this work of art that he'd been working on for 20 years.
One masterpiece, Jesus.
I'm just saying, like, Andy Kaufman, like, even that wasn't original. The whole art is spectacle thing, the whole shocking troll with a message thing, it's not just, like, finished in the modern day, it's all derivative and unoriginal.
Yeah.
In the next episode, we'll have to look at the 20th century, but anyways, I think that's a good place to end this. The fact that when Urinal Guy dies, it turns out he had one more joke to play on the rest of the world. So
we should all be so lucky.
So we're going to start the next episode right after World War I and just watch art explode like a supernova and turn into whatever the hell we call it today. So I'll leave it there. See you next week, guys.
All right, you know the drill. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Support us at kofi.com/Radio Free History or at subscribestar.com/radio-free-history.